Rupa Subramanya, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you. Thank you, Demetri, for inviting me to your show.
It's my pleasure having you on, Rupa. So the you came on my radar because of an article you wrote for the Free Press, where you write consistently about the banking system, but specifically the phenomenon of debanking, or people getting off-boarded from the financial system in some cases permanently,
Hmm.
which obviously has devastating effects. And you highlight some cases that are truly remarkable. One in particular was a guy who runs a nonprofit, and the number I have in my head was something like 600 something million dollars he had raised
Yeah.
through his nonprofit, and this guy
Hmm.
was debanked because I think it was
Hmm.
Wells Fargo wouldn't allow him, wouldn't do business for him, and it was through Stripe. We'll have a chance
Right.
to get into that, as well as a number of other topics that you write about, including the right to die, which is this. It's basically euthanasia, people's right to medically assisted suicide, and the way it's being abused in Canada and the Netherlands. We'll have a chance to talk about freedom of speech issues, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and its introduction in various areas. It's this phenomenon. We'll have a conversation about that, as well as a number of other cultural issues. But before we get into that, tell me a little bit about you. How did you get into journalism? How did you get into writing? How do you also, like, how do you define yourself? Are you a journalist, or what do you do?
Great questions, Demetri, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So just a little bit about me. I am originally from India. That's where I was born. I spent my formative years in the United Arab Emirates. And, I actually trained as an economist when I came to Canada as a student more than 25 years ago. So I have a master's degree in economics and international affairs. So journalism was the furthest thing from my mind. I did like writing a lot. I liked being in the idea space. I liked debates and and discussion over issues that animated me. So I suppose in a way, writing was always going to be in the stars for me, if you will. And I really just happened to get into by accident. I happened to be in India. I for a conference, and at this point I was living in Canada, but I was visiting India, and editor at the Wall Street Journal. We were chatting, and they were launching an online presence in India, and he asked me if I wanted to write. They were looking for people to write. And I said, sure. And I was actually there looking for jobs in investment banking and so on. But, I said, well, yeah, I love writing, and I'm going to get into, here's my first piece. And that's really how it began. I began to really enjoy writing, and I abandoned this dream of finding a job in investment banking, and became a full-time writer. So that's how I got into journalism. And over the years, I've written for the Wall Street Journal, I've written for Foreign Policy, I freelance a fair bit till I wound up at the Free Press, which used to be called Common Sense. When I first began writing for them. And my first big story for them was about the truckers' protest here in Canada, where I live. So I've basically been writing for them. I'm exclusive to the Free Press, and yeah, so that's how I got into journalism.
Great. So I'm glad you brought up the truckers' protest, because I think this was the first time that this story really blew up across the United States and presumably in Canada, where you
Hmm.
live. Refresh my memory and that of my audiences about what happened in Canada and how that can lead us into a conversation about this phenomenon of debanking.
Absolutely. So I live in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, and in 2022, January 2022, a big convoy of trucks descended on the capital. The truckers were protesting a vaccine mandate that they were required to get the COVID-19 vaccine to go into the United States and return to Canada. And they objected to that, saying, we don't want to get this vaccine, and they were exercising their right to not get the vaccine. But what they ended up doing was they were really capturing what most people in this country were feeling at that time. People were tired of the lockdowns. They were tired of the restrictions. Things, the pandemic restrictions in Canada, I would argue, were a lot worse than they were in other countries, barring Australia and New Zealand. But, compared to even the United States, even within the United States, there were, Florida was very different from, say, New York State, in terms of its restrictions. In Canada, every single province in Canada was, had very similar policies, and schools were closed. You couldn't even go to a hiking trail. They shut down hiking trails. But the things that were open, bizarrely enough, were cannabis stores and the liquor stores. But the gyms were closed. Everything else that was good for you were closed. Anyway, the truckers were capturing, were channeling this public sentiment, and most of us thought that it would just be a motley crew of people, a few trucks, maybe a few protesters showing up. And I'd seen these protests happen very frequently in the capital during the pandemic, and it was nothing to write home about. It was just a few people protesting against the against pandemic restrictions. But when I first, that morning when I woke up and I went to check out the protests, it was huge. This is in the dead of winter. I don't know if you've been to Ottawa, but anyone who's been to Ottawa, it's one of the coldest capitals in the world. And it was freezing cold, and you had all of these people who'd shown up to support the truckers, and the protest just got bigger and bigger with each passing day. And each passing day, it got colder and colder and colder. And so one of the things that struck me about this thing was, well, this is not happening in the summer when it's really nice. These people are very serious about what they believe in. They're braving the conditions, standing outside for 10, 12 hours. The truckers are sleeping in their trucks. Some people are just camped out in the cold. But this was extremely important for them to get for the establishment to hear where they were coming from, because their concern and what they were really angry about was the fact that they had been ignored this whole time. No one was listening to them. The politicians were not listening to them. In fact, the politicians, including the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, were demonizing them. They were characterized as racist and misogynist and white supremacist. I spent like 3 weeks speaking to, I can't even keep track of the number of people I spoke to, but I spoke to pretty much everybody who was there. And, these were just average people who had not been listened to for years. They'd been ignored, and they just wanted to be heard. They just wanted to be able to exercise their right to free speech, their right to bodily autonomy. And all of those things they felt had been essentially taken away from them during the course of the pandemic.
So I want to ask you about the legal framework or the legal foundation that is relied upon to remove people from the financial system. But before I ask you about that, you mentioned free speech. What is I'm familiar with the legal framework, which is constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
It's the First Amendment guarantees the right to free speech in the United States. But what is the law in Canada around that?
Well, we don't have the 1A, and that's what makes America so incredibly unique, is that the First Amendment is, it's constitutional protected right to free speech. We don't have that in Canada, and most countries in the world don't have that. In Canada, we have something called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it's not really, something that and this came to light during the protests, actually, that it was just completely just pushed aside, ignored, and what the government did was it invoked an Emergencies Act to get rid of the protesters. Very draconian measure that it's only been used during wartime. to quell dissent, to get people to not protest, to get them out. And this is what the prime minister did. And it was extraordinary because it really meant that he was crushing peace, what essentially was peaceful dissent, um, and and um, and so in Canada, so we don't have that constitutionally protected right to free expression.
Mm.
Anytime the government feels that you're crossing a line, they can pretty much step in and make and make that very clear to you, as happened during the truckers' protest.
So we're going to have a chance to talk about free speech more because also this is open to interpretation, and there's a
Hmm.
huge debate and controversy in the United States around this issue that you and I have discussed offline, and some parts of which I've discussed on the podcast. So let's go back to the debanking issue.
Hmm.
What is the legal framework that's relied on to remove people from the financial system? And I'm presuming that most of this is driven out of the United States, correct? Or was initiated out of the United States primarily with the Bank Secrecy
Yes.
Act and the Patriot Act?
Yeah, the focus of the story was the United States, but debanking has actually happened in the UK. It happened to Nigel Farage last year with Coutts Bank. It's happened in Germany to the AfD, the far-right political party in Germany. So and it's happened here in Canada as well. During the truckers' protest, about 800 bank accounts were frozen. People were debanked actually for giving money to the to through GoFundMe. They donated a whole bunch of they donated money for the truckers, and a list of those people was actually something that the government got a hold of and debanked some of these individuals.
Yeah.
And there were people who were without a bank account for a couple of weeks. So so it happens everywhere, but the focus of the story was America. And there have been stories over the years of people, who'll take to social media and say, my bank just mysteriously closed my account without explanation. I've tried speaking to the manager. I've asked them what is going on, and no explanation, no explanation. So that's the common thread with each one of these stories. So I wanted to understand what was going on, what's driving this, what's creating, what's creating the situation. So one thing I noticed was, from the stories that were already out there, most of these people, um, um, you know, pointing to this issue were conservatives. Um, these were pastors doing good humanitarian work overseas, helping orphan children, orphans, and women who are widows. These are people working in places like Uganda, and suddenly Bank of America or Wells Fargo or whichever big bank that they have an account with tells them your risk profile just doesn't match our comfort level essentially. And so you have 2 weeks or you have 30 days to shut to take your money out, withdraw your money, and it was nice doing business with you, but we can't do business with you anymore. That's it. That's the end of the story. But it turns out it's not just evangelical Christians, it's not just conservatives, it's not just Republicans, it's also Muslim Americans who have experienced debanking,
It's
and
also
so
Melania Trump and Barron
it's
Trump.
also Melania Trump and Barron Trump. So it goes all the way to the top, and it's really extraordinary. So I really got into it, trying to figure out like what's driving this? What's the legislation? What is there a legislation, or is it just some algorithm? Some people I spoke to said, "Oh, it's just an algorithm. The algorithm will like get triggered if your name sounds suspicious. So Mohammed, for example, or a Muslim name, attached to a bank account, could trigger the algorithm." But I think that's a cop out, really, in my opinion. I think there's something else going on. That
Mhm.
there's a method to this. There's a process here. And so it's the Bank Secrecy Act, which came about in 1970, and it's the Patriot Act. So you have these two things working together. The Patriot Act, which came up, was put into place after 9/11, was meant to go after um, foreign terrorists, Al Qaeda, Taliban, you name it. Um, but what ended up happening under and I think the I'm just going to make an I'm pretty confident in saying this, having researched this quite extensively. I think George W. Bush and his administration, when they came up with the Patriot Act, I don't think that they envisioned a situation where it would actually be used against Americans. It would be used against a parent objecting to gender ideology being taught to their child in school, where that parent.
Has it been used in that situation, or is that a
Uh,
hypothetical?
well, no, I have not been able to track this person down, but there's a lot of like anecdotal there are lots of anecdotes out there how parents have been labeled as domestic terrorists, and domestic terrorism suddenly became a big a thing.
Hmm.
It started under Barack Obama. So it started with, and that's how financial surveillance really, really, became that what it is right now. That's how you can trace its origin. Uh, it happened with Operation Chokepoint
Hmm.
in I think about 2011 or 2012 thereabouts, where the Obama administration um, went after businesses that they found to be unsavory. They were ideologically opposed to these people, even though they were all legal. These businesses had a right to exist. Payday lenders, people who sell guns, for example. And a bunch of these businesses actually had to shut down because that was the whole premise of this policy. It literally is to choke the business, and so it doesn't, so it ceases to exist. And when this came to light, a lot of people were upset, and Operation Choke Point eventually came to an end. I think President Trump, when he became president, took an executive decision, and put an end to Operation Choke Point. You would think that would be the end of it. But the thing is, the thinking behind Operation Choke Point, prevailed and it
And
continued under
the know-how of the
yeah,
regulations and the laws and the ability to exploit them for political
yeah,
purposes.
yeah. And you have now you're under your uh, Joe Biden is president. Things are getting increasingly polarized. The pandemic happens, and you're seeing a weaponization of the financial system in a way that hasn't happened before. So there was a one of my first stories about the financial system was about how PayPal went about canceling people, and for speaking out uh, on a range of different issues. You could be you could talk about you're a biologist, so Colin Wright, who's a well-known evolutionary biologist, speaks out against gender ideology, and he had a PayPal account, and he found himself without a PayPal account uh, for uh, for uh, for his opinion, and I profiled a bunch of different people in very similar situations. And so now back to debanking. These are big banks who are taking these decisions, and the clients, their customers, have no idea why they've been debanked. They're not given any reasons, because the Bank Secrecy Act actually protects banks. It enables banks to be in a position where they can say, look, we don't have to tell you anything. We're not under any obligation. In fact, we're not supposed to tell you anything. So what the Patriot Act and the Bank Secrecy Act, in a sense, does is it it gives the state more oversight to regulate and intervene in the financial sector, even in individual people's bank accounts. And that's the kind of thing that makes debanking possible. It actually strengthens the relationship between the state and the financial sector, leaving average people in the dark.
There's something I want to clarify with you. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, in the case of, well, it's not obvious, but one can imagine that in the case of Melania Trump and Barron Trump, there was someone within the White House or within the government actually reaching out to their bank and trying to get them offboarded. But in other cases, as you say, the decision making starts at the banks, which are responding to an incentive structure coming out of the government. And so my one of my questions is, first of all, let's break it down this way. Do we have some idea of what percentage of this activity is really being driven by the banking system and being driven by the banking system primarily to avoid running afoul of government regulations or government directives?
No, we don't. We don't. See, there's a black hole here when it comes to data. We don't even know what percentage of America has been debanked.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, we don't have this data, and that was one of the reasons why this story took as long as it did, because I've spoken to pretty much everybody for this story, who knows a thing or two about debanking. This data just doesn't exist. And so so we and there's a reason why it doesn't exist. Again, it goes back to this secrecy, the lack of transparency, I'm sure at some level in the banking, somewhere, someone in the banking system, some higher up actually knows what is going on here. But unfortunately, the public is not privy to this knowledge, to this information. Um, um, yeah, so the point here is, Dimitri, is that they're not even obligated to tell you why you've been debanked and how many people have been debanked.
So, I have another specific question about what we were just talking about in terms of specifics, but this thing about they're not allowed to tell you, it is so terrifying, and it's not just in the case of debanking. We've seen this all over the place. I mean, the first time I came across this was in the years after 9/11 with the no-fly lists.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people like Naomi Wolf. I remember she was a famous person who had declared that she was suddenly on a no-fly list, and she couldn't understand. She couldn't know why. She didn't know why, and she had no one.
Mm-hmm.
No one could tell her. Um, the same is true for the no-buy lists. The same is true as well for private media companies that might take you off of their social media platforms or uh, delist your YouTube channel or whatever it is. The inability to get answers is a terrifying thing, and it kind of it's part of this change in society, which I think is not just a government thing. I don't have an answer for why exactly, but we all feel it, where everything's become less personal, or less personable, and you just can't get somebody on a phone to solve a problem. And again, a perfect example of this in the debanking case was the guy that ran the nonprofit. I
Mm-hmm.
think it was called Launch Good, and he
Yep.
got notification from Stripe that he could no longer be using their services, and he flew over to Stripe and had
Yeah.
a whole conversation with like 13 people in a conference room, and they couldn't give him any answers, and that's just so demoralizing.
Well,
So
I'll tell you just an update to that story. So he's been offboarded again after my story appeared.
really, because he had gotten
Yeah,
another bank, so he got offboarded
yeah,
from that bank.
yeah. And he told me that he fully expected it to happen after the story published. I mean, he was not, he was happy with the story, but he fully expected it to happen. And it did happen. And again, no explanation.
Now, the
Uh,
context there is that he's providing aid relief, including to people in Gaza, and the suspicion here is that there's um, some kind of communication coming out of either the Israeli government or factions within the United States that are pro-Israel that want to stop the sending money to Gaza because it could somehow be intercepted, or a
yeah,
case could be made that it could be intercepted by Hamas. And
absolutely.
that is the reason that they're shutting him down.
Yeah, but there's a lot of aid that goes into Gaza that comes from the government aid. Um, um, uh, you know. So it's not just charities like LaunchGood or crowd funding platforms like LaunchGood, which are involved in this space. But look, I mean, when you're operating in an area like that, it's not always um, easy. It's not always inadvertently, perhaps some of this could end up in the wrong hands. I've spoken to Chris many times over the course of this story, and he, comes across as an incredibly honest businessman. He's trying to do good in the world, but unfortunately, because of the nature of his work and where some of this work happens, that it actually captures the problem with this whole debanking, with debanking, because you have someone who's actually trying to do some good here, but for some reason, for maybe ideological reasons, or for the fact that the banks are not comfortable doing business with someone they think might
They're risk
might
averse.
give
They're
them a
corporations. They're risk
yeah,
averse. They don't want to
might
take
give
any
them a
risks. They
yeah,
don't care.
that might ruin their brand name, for example. All it takes is for people to say, hey, this crowdfunding platform is
Of
is
course.
funding Hamas, and their banking partner is this bank, and this bank should be canceled if they don't cancel their business with this crowdfunding platform. We've seen this kind of stuff play out
Yeah.
online all the time, whether it's happening to Chris, whether it's happened to Colin Wright with respect to PayPal. The point is that innocent people, and I think they're all innocent people, get caught up in this.
Yeah. No, no, totally. I mean, I'll give an anecdote for folks. This podcast is distributed on many international airlines, and I won't say. Actually, I think it's all of them now. It started with a few of them. It started with some of the airlines in Asia, who were particularly sensitive for certain types of content. But now, not American Airlines, the company, but U.S. Airlines, have become very sensitive for to have anything that's political on their platform. So they won't have it. Even
Mm,
exceptional content that isn't, because this stuff on this podcast is not the kind of incendiary political stuff that you see. Thoughtful
hmm
discussions, they just don't want it. They don't want it
hmm
because it's not, and they've told me why, and it's that they don't want something to go viral. Those are the words they use. They don't want something that I
mm,
have put on their platform to go viral in a negative way that negatively impacts their brand. So I can understand the incentives of the private sector in this case. And I think, this also makes me wonder, have you seen evidence that there's been an acceleration in this trend, not just after COVID, but also after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the sanctions put on Russians? Because one other area where I imagine this has been abused is Russian, and I know it's been abused against Russian nationals who've had nothing to do with the regime,
Yeah,
but who have
yeah,
gotten caught up in stuff like this. So has there been, because oftentimes I feel like what happens with this kind of stuff is legislation is introduced and then subsequent crises or some types or certain events happen that then become catalysts for further abuse of power with respect to those particular, legislative changes or rules. So have
yeah.
you seen that with COVID and then again with Ukraine?
For sure, in the Russian, we saw that with, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, with sanctions, and there was this, the environment where any association with Russia, you could be a Russian classical musician, a pianist, or an opera singer, and your thing is art and music, but you found yourself suddenly canceled, uninvited to, performances, and suddenly everything changed for you. You're not even politically, you're not even in the political space. So we've certainly seen that. I mean, I'll give you a small example of this right here in Ottawa, where I live. Um, there was a cafe called the Russian Tea Room, and it wasn't even owned by a Russian. It was owned by a Lebanese guy, but it had to shut down because it was called Russian Tea Room. and that it went out of business because people objected to Russian
Well, wait, time out.
in the
Just
name.
I want to clarify something because, objectively, no offense, like Canada, the situation in Canada is kind of crazy.
It is.
So maybe I am missing something here, but are you saying that people stopped attending the cafe and that's why they had to close down, or there was a
Yeah,
directive that demanded that they close down?
no, there's no
Okay,
directive.
people just kind of went crazy and they were like, we
Yeah,
don't want to go to the Russian tea room. That's fascinating.
yeah, but it's related to what I'm saying here with respect to all of these things that we've just talked about, which is um, for these businesses and when it comes to debanking for the banks, as you say, they're risk averse and they're very particular about their brand being associated with something that the public, all it takes is one viral campaign on social media on X saying that this bank is doing business with someone that we disagree with, so they need to stop doing business with this person that we disagree with. And we've seen this play out over and over again. So during the pandemic, it was any scientist that went against the status quo, any scientist that challenged the narrative that was prevailing at that time, or the scientific consensus that was prevailing at that time. And then the Russia-Ukraine thing happened. It was anybody who questioned anyone who raised questions about the conflict, or anybody who had any kind of association with Russia, right? No, I'm not even talking about politics. It could just be the Russian tea room owned by a Lebanese guy, finds himself suddenly out of business
Hmm.
because people won't patronize his business anymore. I, if I can get into this, I personally have been at the receiving end of something like this shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, where an academic at a university in Canada went through my social media feed where I was, raising concerns about the possibility of a nuclear war. I wasn't taking any sides. I was pointing to the neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian army and so on. And I don't even have any expertise in this area. I was just weighing in on an issue that was unfolding at that time. And before I know it, a couple of months later, he publishes an academic study, essentially implying that that I'm spreading Russian disinformation. And I'm on
Hmm.
this list along with Glenn Greenwald, Tulsi Gabbard, and a bunch of other people. And this kind of thing it can be ruinous.
Hmm.
When you're someone like me, I don't have Elon Musk kind of money where I can, sue people and take them to court and litigate this and get the best lawyers. But the thing is, you wind up on a list like this, it's like, well, what do I do here? This is defamatory.
Hmm.
But the point is, we are in a situation right now where you can just accuse someone of something that they haven't done,
Yeah.
and hoping it'll stick, and that you'll get away with it. And I
Yeah.
think that's what banks and big businesses are afraid of. They're very afraid of their brand, and they want to protect it as much as they can, I think.
This is probably a good opportunity to transition to speech, free speech, censorship, also social media. And I can offer an anecdote. First of all, I just want to sympathize with you. I think it's very scary. And
Hmm.
it's one thing if you're a corporation because you're making a cold, calculated decision that if it moves against you, it's going to cost you billions of dollars. But in the case of an individual like you, it could cost you your livelihood and your
Hmm.
ability to live. Um, and so it's very scary. It creates a lot of silencing, and journalists have to tread very carefully. Now, I had a similar example that's not something that concerns me at all because I know that I've built a really strong track record, so that I don't have to be intimidated by these types of situations. But I did an episode very recently with Joshua Landis, who's been on the podcast before. In some last time was about 4 years ago to talk about Syria and the U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East, etc. And I brought him back on to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm.
a possible um, renewal of the Arab Accords, and Landis is probably has a more pro-Arab point of view. But the truth also is that if I was being fair, I'm probably much more pro-Israeli for reasons not having to do with ideology or religion, but because of my Greek heritage and my appreciation for what the Jewish diaspora and Israelis have been able to build in that part of the world. And I think also a lot of the conversations around it oftentimes are very skewed. But in any case, I published the podcast last week and I had tweeted out about it, and someone, um, not a particularly big account, but maybe 20,000 followers, a fund manager, uh, accused me of all my guests being anti-Israel, which is not a big accusation. Who cares, whatever. But um, I obviously took issue with it, and I had a bit of an argument with the guy, and he continued to make up some other false accusations. But the point is, Israel Palestine is a great example because if I didn't feel like I was very careful with all my podcasts to sort of be factual and exact, and even if I
Mm-hmm.
was, I could easily find myself in a situation where, let's say, if this guy had 10x the number of followers or 100x the number of followers, I could easily find myself in this cascading situation where accusations are being leveled against me, followers are unfollowing me. I don't, whatever it is, it's scary,
Mm-hmm.
and there's like a kind of mob element to it, and it also doesn't serve anyone because even if you have different views on Ukraine or Israel, the value isn't debating the ideas. It's not in attacking the person. So anyway, I just thought I would sort of sympathize with you on that. So let's talk about the speech issue, because I
Mm-hmm.
think here this kind of breaks down into two separate buckets for
Mm-hmm.
me, and this is something you and I talked a little bit about in a pre-interview, which is
Mm-hmm.
that one, there is this sort of political censorship phenomenon, which we'll have a chance to maybe begin our conversation about, and then there is the other phenomenon, which is content moderation. And I think that on the political right in America, these two sort of there's like darkness on the issue of content moderation, the power of internet platforms, and how information is spread and understood, and speech is formulated on the internet. Where again, it's not speech the way we think of speech when the Constitution was written. It's not people walking into a town hall and vibrating their vocal cords and generating sounds through the air. There's no analog speech. This is a very different world that we're living in. And the power that these platforms have, which I think also these big tech platforms, when taken all together, have their equivalent annual revenues or the equivalent GDP, exactly the metrics are, I'm not sure, are basically higher than every country in the world except
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
GDP is the wrong number, but
Their revenue, their annual revenue,
it's some number
profits.
I've heard, and I should have
Yeah,
been better
yeah,
prepared
yeah.
to cite it. But these are huge corporations, so
Mm-hmm.
they have incredible power to not only define our speech, to limit it,
Mm-hmm.
to censor it, to amplify it, but also to define our realities as we slip into
Mm-hmm.
an increasingly digital world. So that's something I want to talk
Mm-hmm.
about too. But let's talk about political censorship because this is a real thing. We just talked about how Melania Trump and Barron Trump had their bank accounts, how they were debanked. I think they were at Mellon Bank. I can't remember actually where they were.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say that, but they were debanked. Clearly a political move. What exactly is going on right now with people's ability to say what they want to say in this country? And how do we differentiate between sort of government protected speech, which is the First Amendment, versus just the phenomenon that we've described now, the same phenomenon of private companies making risk averse decisions, the same thing happening on social media or other places where people are getting attacked and their reputations are being slandered, having nothing to do with government, but just because of the nature of discourse, how things are happening, losing their jobs, etc. So, what is really going on here?
Well, I mean, we're kind of in this Orwellian place right now, I think, when it comes to free speech and censorship. And you know, we've whether it's debanking or someone getting their accounts canceled on PayPal, or a scientist or an epidemiologist who had a different point of view on lockdowns and restrictions during the pandemic. All of these people were were canceled, and some of them fired, some of them lost their jobs. Their lives have been ruined because someone didn't agree with what they were saying. And that's extraordinary, because that's, if you really break this down, that's what essentially it comes down to. You're trying to, one side has become, and I don't know what the side is, because I'm also seeing this now happen on the conservatives, among the conservatives, on the right as well, where the same people who decried the cancellation of people with a dissenting point of view are now trying to cancel these people. And I think on the Israel-Palestine issue, I think that I saw that happen shortly after October 7th. And it was very disappointing, because for me, as someone who believes, I'm a free speech absolutist, I think you should be able to have these opinions, and if you don't like it, you don't have to listen to this person, right? But to take this to this extraordinary step of trying to ruin someone's life, I think reflects. And then you also have, like, companies and powerful people have, going along with it, and so therefore adding their weight to what is happening here, instead of saying no. There's a way to settle these differences, and it doesn't involve canceling someone. So I think we're in a very unfortunate situation where we've stopped, we've lost the ability to have a conversation with someone
Hmm.
that we disagree with. And I think that's what it's fundamentally come down to. And politicians, this is a very cynical view of the world. Someone might accuse me of that, but I think the political establishment realizes, there's a way. This is a great way to divide society, really. Divide and rule has always worked. For politicians throughout the centuries. And so, having one group of people go after another set of people has become political. Let's face it. And that's very unfortunate, and that's not where we want to be as a society. In the US, as I'd like to point out again, is very unique in having a constitutional protected right to free speech. And so the US is still doing better than a lot of other places. And again, my comparison here is just, I'm just north of the border from where you are. And you don't want to be where Canada is right now. And that's not the situation you want to be in, where peaceful dissent is crushed through an Emergencies Act. Right now, this country is busy putting out proposals to create a separate set of criminal laws to go after people who deny that Indigenous children. Uh, you know, we're not that that genocide denial, and no one even knows if there was a genocide that actually happened here with the indigenous community. But if you were to deny that, you could wind up in jail. And these are serious proposals that are being put forward by politicians, and a lot of people seem to be okay with it. So that's certainly not the direction you want to be in America. You want to go in America. Sure, there are lots of problems in the U.S., but I think at the end of the day, you know, constitutional protected speech is still something that sets America apart from the rest of the world, and that's something to be cherished and protected, in my view.
Yeah. So let's linger here a bit. I don't know that we're going to get any clarity on it, but we can try. First of all, I just want to say, like, there's obviously a similar history of laws around uh, pro pro Nazi sympathies in Europe. The
Hmm.
distinction I would draw there is simply one of degree, which is that Europe fought against Nazi occupation, and it's the World War II sits at the center of the modern European project and post World War II history. It's a defining period on the continent. And so one can understand why that particular issue carries so much weight or has carried so much weight or had an exception within Europe. What's interesting about the examples that you point to, this sort of what was it, pro-genocide or anti or genocide denial?
No,
You said
so
genocide denial. So
yeah,
I just think what's amazing about this is that
yeah.
we seem to be scavenging for new issues to become enraged about and
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
censor people about. And so, like, back to your point about us, because I think it was actually a really interesting insight of yours that or statement that we've lost the ability to have conversations. And so, let's talk about that a little bit. I don't want to put everything on social media because
Mm-hmm.
this everything is complicated, and we've gone through periods in society, and all societies go through stages if they're old enough civilizations where they have there's a lot of internal dissent and cacophony. But I can't help but feel, based on what we know about social media, that social media is a significant driver of the uh, dysfunction in our discourse. Do you agree with that? How do you feel about that statement?
Um, well, let's l- instead of saying social media, how about we say the town square? Because that's how we had conversations before social media in the old days. People would gather in the town square and catch up on what was going on. I think
But
and
it's not
have
happening
debates.
it's not happening on a town square. It's happening on a server controlled by private companies that are defining objective functions that that structure the types of conversations that are happening.
Sure. So there are algorithms for sure that are right now directing, um, what you consume, essentially. I can
What you
vouch for
consume, what
that.
you want, what you see, what you think exists.
Everything. But and there is a legitimate problem here, I think, when it comes to big tech. We have oligopolies essentially, and that is a legitimate problem. And there are high barriers to entry. You have fixed costs that prevent companies from entering this sector. And especially, I think this is especially the case with social media, where you have all of these network externalities, right? So, and you have these agglomeration economies basically happening in the sector. You're on X because everybody else is on X. You're on Instagram because everybody else is on Instagram, and that's how you have these agglomeration economies where everybody just attaches themselves to these platforms. But here is where we run into a problem. What should we do about it? Should we do anything about it? And that's where I think free speech enters the picture. As far as I'm concerned, anything short of incitement to violence, um and that really is the ultimate for me. That's the ultimate red flag. I think a lot of this stuff which I find unsavory, I myself have been like threatened, and on social media, and I've been called names, and I've been told all kinds of things. It's upsetting. It makes me angry, but what do I want to do anything about it? I think our initial instinct when in that moment of anger and frustration, we're overwhelmed by all of this that is happening there because it's concentrated right on this one platform. That's all you're seeing. Is we I think it's human nature to have this knee-jerk reaction to want to control something that you cannot control.
But
But
is
I
that
think you,
mm,
sorry, yeah, go
well,
ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we have to I don't agree with the framing because first of all, I don't think that what you have on these platforms is free speech.
Why do you say that? I mean, why is it not free speech?
People are throttled all the time on these platforms. Some people's voices are amplified on these platforms. We don't all have equal speech. We're not all walking into a town square.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. So let's one thing we have to be clear about free speech. Free speech is a relationship between the government and private
Right,
citizen and an
exactly.
individual, right?
Well, the way we
That,
conceptualize free speech in terms of a government right,
yeah,
a government
but we
provided or government afforded right.
exactly a private organization like X or Meta um, is a private organization. It can do what it wants
Correct.
within the law. So a lot of people tend to use free speech very loosely. So when Elon Musk says, free speech on X, he's misusing that term in my opinion. I think what he really means is that we're going to be as politically neutral as possible. We're not going to throttle you like the other guys. We're not going to can't shut your account down because you said something that someone disagrees with. I think that's what he means. um, and that's a better way of saying it. So a lot, people will object when when you block someone. Oh, this person believes in free speech. They're free speech absolutists, but they're blocking me because they disagree with me, or because I've been like I'm trolling them or whatever. That's not free speech. If you come into my space, you come into my home, you come into my space, and you tell me things that I don't want to hear, and I'm not interested in that. I don't have to entertain that. I'm exercising my right to not hear you on that subject.
Sure,
I
no,
don't
but
have to.
I,
Yeah.
but I think this is important to clarify because I mean, I want to actually, we could go, this conversation could easily fracture into lots of places, but I want to focus in on the really the reason why I think, first of all, I agree that the way that we traditionally think about guaranteed speech is guaranteed speech to petition the government, to organize, to dissent, but not the ability to say whatever you want in someone's hair salon. If they want to kick you out, they can kick you out. But I think we also need to understand that historically, and there's precedent for this, there's precedents for this in the re-regulation of the American economy during the Second Industrial Revolution, which is that there is a spirit of intent in the Constitution and the framing of the Constitution and the laws of this country that has to be upheld in the changing political, economic nature and technological nature of it. And so what we have today is, in the during the Industrial Revolution, we had a situation where the nature of labor's value was changing relative to capital,
Hmm.
and that was disrupting the physical environment in which people could economize their labor, and it was creating a concentration of power in the form of the baronialists, the capitalists, the people, the
Hmm.
industrialists, that was corrupting the political process. Today, we have something similar with these internet platforms. And as we move into a world where people spend more of their time in digital spaces, which means that they spend more of their mind space inside of servers that are controlled by private corporations, we have a fundamental corruption of the Constitution. We have a corruption of our political system because the way that democracy works is it depends on the ability of people to discuss ideas and come to consensus in what is relatively a free mind space. Yeah, there are newspapers that are putting out pamphlets. Later, with television and broadcast media, there were powerful corporations that could push messages onto people, but none of that begins to even remotely compare to the world we're living in today. And so, what we're basically doing is we're moving into the matrix. And I don't know if you may not agree with that. I actually think that is an incredibly appropriate metaphor. It was a metaphor in the late 90s. It's become even less of a metaphor today and more of lived reality. And so, is there, in your mind, is there a point at which uh, private power becomes so great that it needs to be confronted by public policy? And at that point, um, how do you conceptualize that?
Um, Sorry, my cat is interrupting. He's. I'm just gonna push him away. Sorry about that. Um, so your framing of the issue um, makes it sound like you and I don't have any agency, that we're just
Or
automatons
that we're
participating in
losing
this.
that we're losing agency? Yeah.
I I think that has always been a challenge throughout time. Uh, when you always have these power structures, if you want to use that expression. But the fact of the matter is, I'm a participant in this space, and I know what I'm doing. No one is putting a gun to my head. I am aware of the fact that an algorithm is driving, um, what I consume, what I see, what I read. Um, I know that because I'm an active participant in this space. So I have agency. If I don't like what I'm seeing, I can exit. I can leave. Um, my point is, why are we denying agency here? Why are we denying our own ability to make decisions, whether to participate in this space or not? Um, we're not compelled to be on X. We're not compelled to consume any of this stuff. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You can
Well,
just take a break. Yeah.
well, first of all, I would dispute that on two terms. One, I would dispute that we're not losing agency. I think we're losing agency in the course of our participation on these platforms, and I think, pardon me, and I think that the framing of, well, if I don't like what I see, I can just leave, also leaves out the fact that you're not seeing all sorts of things, and what you're seeing, what you're not seeing, is being determined by the platform that you're on. I also think it's important to note that there are that these platforms and the way that discourse is being conducted and the strident nature of discourse has a negative impact across society. So in other words, my ability as an individual to live in a safe country and in a country that functions properly from a public policy point of view is dependent on the how informed my fellow citizens are, how efficient and effective and truthful the platforms of information are. And we're basically saying that we're okay with living in a world where the dominant media platforms are structured to farm engagement of human beings who don't have to pay or there's no consumer relationship between people and these internet platforms or Google or anything else. We're just the farm animals to be herded and to be milked, and that leads to some really perverse outcomes, whether we're talking about political discourse, whether we're talking about the spike in incidents of transgender surgeries or or demand for hormonal interventions on the part of young girls who spend an enormous amount of time on Instagram, rising depression rates. So when you compare, for example, it's something that 60 Minutes has covered. I haven't spent too much time on it, but it's an anecdotal example of TikTok in China versus TikTok here. You see very different outcomes in terms of what content is being displayed where. And that is not to say that I have the solution about what the dictate should be. Like I've said on this podcast and I've said on social media many times, one simple one that we can all agree on is transparency. Another example that I've told you, I think I mentioned this in a private conversation that Azza Raskin has brought up in a conversation with Yuval Harari on a panel some weeks ago or some months ago, which is that Facebook had discovered some years ago that the single best thing they could do to improve discourse on their platforms, to improve the quality of discourse, to reduce disinformation, all the negative stuff, however you want to define it, was to
Mhm.
reduce the amount of times that a post could be shared.
Mm.
That's simple. That's not a political decision. That's not the government saying we want Republicans, we want Democrats. It's high level decisions based on what effect they have on the quality of discourse or on the truthiness of the outcome that we're seeing. And but my point, and then I'll let you, and I don't want to keep
Yeah.
droning on, is that we seem to be blind to this because, or a lot of people on the right seem to be, they don't want to see this because they have this idea of like, well, I don't want the government getting involved in speech. And I just think it's a totally wrong framing. If there were chemical companies polluting the estuaries and kids were developing tumors across the United States, no one would say, I don't want the government involved in telling private businesses what to do or how to act most efficiently. People would be like,
Hmm.
that's ridiculous.
Hmm.
But it's much more difficult to see it because the pollution is so invisible. We live with it every day. We swim with this discombobulated discourse, with this cacophony and this shouting, and people who are YouTube stars and influencers rising to prominence in political conversations because they're really good at farming engagement. And so we have this really broken media landscape, and I see it firsthand because of the nature of the job that I do and because of what I'm willing to and not willing to do. And so I would just ask you one more time, given, I mean, is your view basically that like we shouldn't try to solve that because it's a slippery slope, and we should just if that just means that we end up with a cascade into fascism, not fascism, Donald Trump fascism, but fascism as in, a few private corporations basically run the government and they control the servers and we just become farm animals in their feudal, dystopia. We should be okay with, not we should be okay with that, but that's just the price of liberty.
Hmm. Um, okay, so going back to your example about Facebook limiting, how many times you can share a post because it could be misinformation or disinformation, however they describe it. Now, who determines what is misinformation and disinformation? And I
Sure.
say this as someone who has posted factually correct posts on the Russia-Ukraine invasion for 2 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was called disinformation. And this is so we run into this problem constantly, right? How a lot of people who have been canceled and who've been shut out of the public discourse have been accused of spreading misinformation, disinformation, when in fact they were just saying something that was different. So who determines
No,
this
I,
is the
I agree
question.
with
Who
that.
defines it? Yeah,
No, I hear that, but that's why I
yeah,
brought the example of resharing.
yeah,
There's nothing specific. You're not saying this is misinformation, this is disinformation. You're
yeah.
saying, just like you're saying, for example, if you put a 10-second delay on a tweet, how is that picking what is and is not disinformation? All that's saying is we're going to create a barrier between when you think of a stupid idea and when you decide to hit the button on it. And we're going to reduce the amount of stupid ideas in general that come out of your mouth because there's a delay on when you can speak.
Well, here's another.
That's a design issue, and these are platforms are designed in that manner.
Okay, so here's a great example of which a recent example actually. So the Joe Rogan interview of Donald Trump. It doesn't actually show up like in Google searches at all. Several
Apparently, there
people
were
have.
moments when it wasn't. I every time I searched for it, I was able to find it, but
Well,
directly at
I
the top of the
haven't.
page. But
Yeah, I wasn't like a lot of people. Like I experienced issues finding it as well. It's an example of, and that's just one example. There have been other examples in the past where social media companies, YouTube especially, will limit
But that's political
what.
censorship.
Yeah,
That's them limiting a specific video for a specific reason.
yeah, because they think that whatever it may be, political censorship, or they think that this person is spreading misinformation, or this is something that they're ideologically opposed to, whatever the reasoning behind it is, the action is always the same, which is to throttle views. It's to not appear at the top of your searches. So
Well, that's
this
not, but
is,
just, I mean, Rupa, and
yeah,
I appreciate this conversation, but I
yeah.
want to make sure that we're not talking past each other. It's not the same. You're describing a targeted action. You're describing YouTube saying, if this is what happened, we want to throttle Joe Rogan's video with Donald Trump. That's not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is a universal action, something that we identify improves some other metric and reduces the incidence of some other metric that we define to be universally bad.
So are you saying that it should be done across the board for
Absolutely.
everything?
Of course. So the idea of putting a 10-second delay on a tweet, I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm
Yeah.
giving you hypotheticals here. The idea of a 10-second delay on a tweet is a
Hmm.
universal thing. A limiting the number of reshares to 2 reshares is universal. We're not saying Donald Trump supporters aren't going to be able to reshare something, but
Yeah. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you love
No,
Kamala, go for it. We're
yeah,
saying these are design issues. These platforms are very complicated media platforms that are subject to design constraints. And those design constraints inform what we get. The same thing is true. You have a master's degree in economics. You know this better than anyone. The way that we design laws in a
yeah,
country will determine
yeah,
the kind of economy that we get.
yeah. No, I get what you're saying. And I think, yeah, if you're going to apply this, you've got to apply it across the board and not just be selective in your application, for sure. But then we run into other problems, right? A company's right to make certain decisions for itself. What about their rights? So I don't know how this would play out legally in my opinion. But for me, as someone, who's written about free speech issues quite extensively, and I also have, like, I have a personal background in all of this, given where I grew up. I'm always weary when someone says, there's a problem and it needs to be fixed right away, and only the government can do that, right? Because that makes the assumption, or regulation can do that, because that makes the assumption that which may not be the right assumption, and that is that the government is wiser than everybody else.
Let me ask,
They're yeah,
sorry, but let me ask you this. So,
yeah.
do you think that there should be a law that's passed that forbids the FBI and the CIA and the NSA and any three-letter agency from having offices or presence in any private social media platform? Should we pass legislation that prevents them from being able to do that?
Prevent them from being on these.
Prevents the executive branch and the three-letter agencies from stationing people inside of Twitter who are in contact with the content moderation team and are in a position to censor the content of people
Oh,
whose
I,
political
I, I
speech they
think
don't
that would
like.
be, I think it would be awful to have that kind of, policing of
Right.
the
So we should
internet. Yeah.
pass legislation to prevent that from happening.
Yeah. I mean,
Why
I
wouldn't
mean,
we? I agree. My point is
yeah.
this is an example of government government policy. I think the other thing is, and I appreciate you talking with me about this because it's something that I told you. For example, I'm friends with
Yeah.
Jacob Siegel as well. He's been on the podcast, and we had this conversation. For whatever reason, for folks, when I have these conversations with certain folks, it's like I can't seem. It's like we talk past each other, and I think part of it is also the framework that people have in their head about what government is. They think the government is, or in their mind, the government is the FBI and the CIA and the White House and the sort of the machine. But like at the end of the day, the government in the United States is the legislative branch. That is supposed to be the most powerful branch of government,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
we have the ability to make freedom of information requests because of government regulation. This is something that is so like it. The government can be a tool for the people. We've just lost that knowledge in this country. And anyway, so I do want to continue this conversation and give you a chance to sort of finish what you were saying, and then we'll also get to get into a conversation about right to die and DEI as well. But I'm going to move us to the second hour for that, Rupa. For
Mm-hmm.
anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Rupa, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Rupa, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed.